welcome to the second episode of Scholars in a Bar. Today we're going to be talking about what is history. And joining me is Dr. Al Eichelman, who you may remember from our first episode. And our guest scholar who's going to be sharing her insights is Dr. Deane Stephens. Dr. Stephens holds her PhD in history from the University of Southern Mississippi, where she continues to serve on the faculty. So Deane, welcome to joining us here today.
Thank you. I'm so honored.
So both Al and I see ourselves as historians. He actually has a claim to it. I just pretend. But what I'd like to talk about is what is history, because a lot of people are debating history these days and what is proper history. And a lot of people that I run into seem to think that history is the past. Everything that's past is history. Is that right or not?
Oh, no, Mike, that's not right. No. I think that if we think about history, if you want to say it's the past, well, of course it just happened. But it's a cumulative past, I think. And I think that when you talk about history, and students always come up to me and, oh, why do we have to know this and why do we have to know that? And I think that when we look at what has happened before, we have a much broader understanding of what's happening now and what potentially could happen. So I've always thought that when you teach history or you discuss history, you have to, there's no other way to talk about something. It's immediate past, or it's 1,000 years ago, or it's 10,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. But you really are laying the foundation for a deeper understanding, and I really think a deeper appreciation of where we are today.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the current pandemic.
Yes.
And as a historian, you could tell us ways in which history relates to our current situation, I'm sure.
Well, as a medical historian, thank you for that question, Al. I appreciate that. I have just recently given a talk with the Mississippi Historical Society, and this exact same thing came up. The same fear, the same uncertainty, the isolation, the quarantine, and the not understanding completely the way the disease progresses, who's going to contract the disease, how severe it's going to be. I mean, right here in New Orleans as we sit, and of course with the Gulf Coast where I live and where Al teaches on the Gulf Coast campus of University of Southern Mississippi, we suffered terribly across this region with yellow fever. And I can only imagine people living in the 19th century, and 1905 was the last epidemic that occurred. But it's very much like what we're living through now. How are you going to best protect yourself? Who can you interact with? How is the disease going to be transferred? At least we know it's a virus. Yellow fever viral information did not come out until the early 20th century. But just this constant state of stress, and then you add the economic impact into quarantines, and these folks had shotgun quarantines. Mm-hmm. So it was that same exact fear, and we think about problems that we've lived through and diseases we lived through. As a younger person, I remember the HIV scare. How are you going to best protect yourself? What are you going to do when you have a new disease come out? So when you look at the pandemics of the world, and certainly, Al, you can address this better than I mean, go back to leprosy and the Bible and the biblical teachings and things. A lot has not changed in looking at these pandemics as how we, as mere people who are part of the ecology, how we go ahead and navigate through those.
Yeah, well, the Great Plague, which really put an end to the ascendance of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 8th century would be another example of that. But when you mention 1905, one of the things that occurred to me is something that our host just told us, and that the house that we are videoing this, it was built in 1905.
Right.
That tells you something about the correspondence. I mean, it's kind of like the history is kind of still always with us. So.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you just think of, if we're on the medical field, you think of the Hippocratic Oath. Well, you're going back to Hippocrates in ancient Greek medicine. But yet, physicians in today's world, every diploma still has the caduceus on it that goes back to Asclepius, the father of medicine. So we're living in 2020, but we have so much of the history of the whole world that we do live and interact with that when you start talking to students, back to your question, Mike, when you start talking to them, no, we live with history every day, thousands of years of history.
But one of the things that kind of gets me is the idea of separating what is, I would call, true history from oral tradition, from legend, from mythology, because if you can't really know something about the past unless you, in my opinion, unless you can document it. For instance, we could say, what did my grandfather have for lunch 120 years ago on this date?
Right.
Well, he probably ate that day, but we have no record of what he ate, so we could speculate based on he was a rural farmer in Mississippi and the kind of things that they grew and ate, but we really can't know that. So that's not history. That's just speculation about the past. So how, as a historian, do you go separating these things out so you could tell us what really happened?
Well, that's such a good question. And one of the things that we can do as historians is we can do our absolute very best to understand, for instance, with your grandfather. So what were the agricultural products that were being traded around that time? Well, I can go into old records and I can look at the cost of a bushel of corn, and I can see that, and I can see that so many bushels of corn were produced within the county of Mississippi where your grandfather lived. So I might not be able to sit at the table with your grandfather, so to speak, but I can do enough research about what was going on at that time, that year, that I can pretty well hit it on the head. However, I can't always get it right. And I think sometimes, if I may use the word, there's an arrogance that we have to really think about when we are writing history, that we can pull together as much as we possibly can. We can make leaps of faith. We can, at the old historian used to say when I was in school, it's like nailing jelly to the wall. Mm-hmm. We can try to do that, and I think we do a very good job. But I'm always in awe and so respectful of historians who come after me or who are working in the same field I am, that they might just find a letter from your grandfather that said, hey, on this day I sat down and had a great steak. Mm-hmm. There's always that. So history is never a static study. It is constantly being rewritten. And as historians, we try to do it very objectively. You don't bring in your baggage, and that's a very big concern. What's that old saying? Just the facts. Mm-hmm. But I think that's what makes it so interesting, in the fact that you can get perspectives, and a historian perspective said, well, maybe this agricultural product was going on. My perspective is that I'm sticking with the corn. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe somewhere between the truth, melding them together, that's where we're going to know what your grandfather ate.
Is it a fair statement to say that what we can hope for in so many instances is not a literal history, but an approximation?
An approximation based upon factual research. Yes, we weren't there. Now, if you've got that rare journal that absolutely recorded everything, that sits down and says, and this is why these papers are always just such a boon for any historian. If you've got that, you've got a gold mine. You've got a gold mine. But I like your statement.
But is it fair to say that even if you have that, you still have to make the interpretive link?
You do, because you only have his grandfather having lunch.
Because-
What is everybody else having? Yeah.
Because
What is everybody else having?
And the other thing is, I'm thinking of it in terms of even current history. As a person who's done a little bit in biblical history, one of the things I know is that it's always based on in-textual information, but that in-textual information supported by supplementary material that would have been written at the same time, and doing a cultural and historical analysis of the context in which that biblical material is written, plus on top of all of that, any archaeological evidence that might be uncovered.
Right.
And that's always something that's in process. It's never something that's complete.
It is.
And you take that and you apply it to the present day, and what I'm worried, you can have two presidential historians. Presidential historian A, presidential historian B, they're both doing a biography of the same president, and their interpretation of that president totally different.
Totally different. One of the interesting things I always have, and you're just right on the mark, Al, one of the things I always find so interesting is that you can look at newspapers or any other source you want, the exact same event, and this is today too, the exact same event, the exact same time, the exact same, and each paper is going to present it differently. So I think what you're saying is correct, but I think the historian's job is to go through and sift and bring in a third and a fourth and a fifth and as many other as you can to try to get that contextual knowledge and that analysis.
Well, one of the things, I see people that are very attached to what they think they learned about history, and are very reluctant to hear anybody tell them a different story about it. And so we hear this term revisionist history, like it's a pejorative term. But is it a pejorative term really? And how do you as a professional historian see the idea of revisionism in history?
I don't look at it as a pejorative term. I think if it is done with a political agenda, I think then you cross a line. And I'm even going to go out and say I think you cross a moral line. As a historian, I feel that my craft is to present as well as I possibly can what happened and all of the journalism questions, the who, what, where, when, why, but then we also say, well, the so what? What did that mean to society? And if you are trying to revise history for a certain political agenda or a certain political movement, then that is not appropriate. But I think that if you have revision, which you have all of the time, and that's what the historian's craft is based upon. My book comes out, Al's book comes out, a group of historians or theologians read it, and they say, Dr. Eichelman had some very good points. However, he missed this. And then there is a revision of his thesis that comes out in yet another work. But I think that the beauty of that, and I really do think it's a beautiful process, I think the beauty of that is that we are open to this. There are discussions of this, and then again, that better understanding does occur. What do you think, Al?
No, I think that's absolutely correct, and that's why we have, like you said, peer review.
Right.
Because it's not just my opinion, it's my opinion, which others then add to. And then very often, increasingly in terms of scholarship, it's collaborative opinion. More and more of the works that are coming out are not monographs as much as they are collaborative efforts in research. That was very common, that's been very common in the sciences for some time, but it's becoming even as common now, I think, in the humanities. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I definitely agree with that. And I think the scholarship that's coming out is much stronger. I think it's much more broad-based, of course. It's interdisciplinary. I was very honored, too, as a historian, be on a committee of a biology student who was studying Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. So I brought the historical background of the mosquito and its role that it played in yellow fever epidemics, and she then brought the biological aspect of its field and its life cycle and things, and together it really made a much stronger product. And I think people can grasp then the deeper understandings of that hey, this mosquito only liked to be in this beautiful old house. Well, it would have been right outside in your flower pot. She likes still water. Well, that's something that as a historian I might not have tumbled to. So it makes it much better as far as what we disseminate then to what I call the world's knowledge.
But another thing, kind of on this same topic that I brought up on revisionist history, another current hot phrase is cancel culture, where we're seeing people not like the fact that attitudes toward people change. And I'll give you an example, and I'll avoid politics here. When I was in high school or junior high, the great American inventor who gave us electricity and made all of what we're doing possible was Thomas Edison. And he was the great person. Now, his star has sort of been descending in history lately, and we don't look at Edison so much as a great inventor, although he was, as a great businessman who harnessed what he did and made a commercial success. And somebody else's star who's rising is Nikola Tesla, who in fact did give us the technologies that we're using today. So this ebb and flow of ascendancy and descendancy and how people, structures, ideas are looked at, is that natural? Has that always happened?
Oh, I think it's an absolute natural process. I love the term that you use, this ebb and flow. So it's like the tide coming in and out, but it's still within the body of water. So it's still there. History popularity comes and goes. And the history of groups, history used to be top down. It was white elite men top down, and with the beginning of the 50s and through the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, you have almost like a peeling back of an onion, and each of those little peels of that onion, each of them represented perhaps a marginalized group of people, or perhaps voices that heretofore had not been heard. So those changes that have occurred, now history is written. And I remember this argument too, and I think it goes to what you're saying, that, we're going to lose all these great monographs, these sweeping histories of nations and things. But look what we've gained. We've got Native American voices, we've got women's voices, we've got African American voices, we've got religious voices that here, we had not heard. You've got this really better democratic process that now lets people become part of the voice and the history of the nation or the history of the world. I think, what do you think, Al? I mean, I think so.
No, I think that's absolutely true, and I see that especially in the ascendance of African American history. I'm becoming more and more aware of how significant a role African Americans have played in the history of this country, but except for maybe the last 20 to 30 years, that role was never accentuated in any way, shape, or form. And so when we're talking about adding that perspective, it's authentic, and it's very authentic, and it needs to be emphasized because it was so de-emphasized for so many years.
Right. Those who are in power have often had the privilege of writing the history. And I think that now and I think since the mid-20th century, I think that whole perspective has changed. And I think it's much, much for the better, and a absolutely needed change in who you're going to talk about in history and what you're going to write about in history. Yes.
I think Thomas Jefferson wrote James Madison one time and said, "The world in usufruct belongs to the living." And I think that's the way it is with history. Each generation is going to interpret its history differently and through its own lens.
Yes.
And that's the way it's always going to be.
And that's the way it should be. That's really the way it should be, because each interpretation, I think, does create a better history. And, you can go back and you can look all the way from the beginning, go back to Charles and Mary Beard in the early 20th century, and these broad sweeping, and now the economic interpretation. Somebody knows his history,
Spun my head
right. But now we've got so many wonderful, it's almost again just these little splinters that come out, and each one of those, I call them, when I'm teaching research classes, it's almost like a little rabbit trail that you get to go down. And each one of those adds so much to what we need to know as a people for those of us who are still living. Yes.
Kind of staying on this topic, and let's talk about one example of this.
Okay.
That is kind of very much, now I am going to get political here, I guess, a political play, is there was once a thesis that was very popular, particularly here in the South, that was the lost cause thesis of the Civil War. And that is very much in decline now, it seems to me. I believe there was actually a Columbia professor, William Dunning, that sort of promoted this.
He's one of the old school historians.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it really became sort of the set thing, and now that's been part of our revision of history, that this maybe wasn't it. How do you see that, and how do you see that impacting the way your students, who are students in a Southern university, look at American history?
I view it in a very positive light. But many of our students, I don't think, and this is where, as a historian, it becomes so very important for people to understand and to have the information of the time period and what was occurring. So if we're talking about this, and we're talking about, let's just say we're talking about the removal of a Confederate statue. Okay, so maybe we need to understand, and let's go to Mississippi, and let's go to the campus of Ole Miss. So University of Mississippi opens in the 1840s, late 1840s, 1848. Well, in 1848, you have the Texas Revolution has just occurred. You've got the notion that slavery is going to expand into the New Mexico territory and the Arizona territory. You're just 2 years away from one of the greatest compromises in 1850, trying to hold off what becomes the Civil War. And it was just a balancing act. So here we've got this university in 1848 that's created. Well, you go through the Civil War, you go through the Reconstruction years, and then it's not until 1905 or 1906 that you have a statue erected. So what happened between the 1840s and, again, the early 1900s? So, the idea was that after the American Civil War, this lost cause that you mentioned, and I have a wonderful colleague, Karen Cox, who has done a lot of research on this, and she's in North Carolina. And I hope if she watches this, I'm going to say she can speak very well to it. But I think what you really need to remember is that in 1875, 10 years after the American Civil War, so right after the American Civil War, when Confederate states tried to reinstate the old guard back to Congress and it didn't work, and then there's that term that students will recognize, the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans then institute republicanism in the South. And this is when you have newly enfranchised people being able to finally make decisions about their own lives. I mean, if you think about it, there was no decision making that you had. You basically didn't even decide what foods you were going to have, if we go back to our food.
Yeah.
You know, so you have this occurring, and then you have in 1875 something that was often referred to as the Mississippi Plan, where you really create paralegal organizations like the KKK, the Knight of the White Roses, and many others. You begin a series of intimidations and movement to disenfranchise the newly enfranchised. So by 1876, with elections, you have the Republican Party, for the most part, being replaced with, as some call it, the ascendancy of the Democratic Party. Well, I say all of this background only to emphasize the fact that by 1890, you've got Southern constitutions that have listed poll taxes. You have to have literacy, and the vote is basically denied to those marginalized communities that it had been denied to for hundreds of years. So then what are you going to do? You're going to celebrate. And you're going to erect statues, and this is my opinion, but you're going to erect statues to remind the folk that the ascendancy has occurred. And those statues then, in the 90s and 2020, when you look upon those statues, this, I think, is why this is a reminder of hundreds of years of history, and I can certainly understand the offense that is taken, because you've lost, you've gone through the 1960s civil rights movement. We just mentioned women, Native Americans, African Americans, and here you've got this statue, or you've got this whatever that is the continuous reminder of what has gone on before. So I fully understand the repulsion, if I can use that strong of a word, that is going on, and what to do. Then on the other hand, you've got those who look upon it as just a statue of culture. Well, if you really understand the culture and you've really done your history, your history reading, it's a little deeper than that.
Would you say, based on what I'm hearing you say, would you say that the true revisionist history was the revisionist history that occurred in the 1890s to elevate the idea of the lost cause?
That was another revisionist history. That's exactly right. And this idea that, all of this idea, the South shall rise, and the this and the that, and the Mississippi has finally replaced the state flag that had the battle emblem on it of the cross. So it's a revisionist history that is revisiting and revising all the time. It visits something, it revises it, but it was revised out, in my view, into a negative revisionist history, where what had just millions of people lost their lives in the American Civil War, whether from gunshot or from disease or wound festering. And all of this that you just had, and that was supposed to somehow rectify that, it clamps down in constitutions.
Another thing that I'm aware of, and I don't know if you want to speak on this or not, but that the history can be very much tied up with a particular regional perspective. And what I'm getting at by that is that when I was in Chicago, I was never taught the history of the lost cause. And that's what I grew up with. I did not grow up with that history. Of the 50 states, only 11 of them have that history or talk about that history. The other 39, not at all. That's not their perspective on history. Their perspective on history would be the lost cause, thank God. I mean, really, I mean, that it's a totally, so when you're talking about the vast majority of people in this country touting the lost cause, sounds, I don't know what it sounds like, but it doesn't sound like it has a ring of authenticity to it for most people in this country. Only for a certain segment, and certainly not all of the people in 11 of the states of this country.
I would disagree with that, Al. Okay. I think the Lost Cause movement was, as I said, it mainly came out of Columbia University. It was William Dunning who was, am I wrong on that?
No, you're not wrong.
And who was the major proponent of this. And I think, all right, here's what I think it came about. And I tend to be a cynic about a lot of this. I think the event that it was closest to and triggering was the Spanish-American War. And that there was a need to say to all Americans, look, we got to come together to go out and fight Spain. So we need a history that can pardon the South for what they did and bring them back into the fold. And that impotence for the Spanish-American War and then on into World War I is a reason that this theory gained credence. Am I totally off base there?
I think that's so interesting because I look at the Spanish-American War as an imperialistic war.
Oh, yeah.
And, and I'm going into the medical field, the United States stayed in Spain for so much longer than it needed to because it felt like it needed to clean Havana and Cuba and didn't, this arrogance and this imperialism that existed. So maybe that's something that's very interesting in the fact that, what was and what are we going to be cohesive about? And are we going to be cohesive about, and I remember, wasn't it Rudyard Kipling that said the little brown brothers? Mm-hmm. That is that what we're going to do? That we're going to, one more time, the white man's burden. Is that what we're going to do? And was the white man's burden just something that was easily said and wrapped up into this lost cause of the Civil War? It very well, I'm sure it could have been, because it's based upon racism. Economic power and racism, elitism.
And yet we have to, I think, come to grips that the idea of white supremacy, of whites being superior to blacks, was on both sides of the Civil War an accepted idea.
Oh, sure.
And
sure.
This really was up until post-World War II,
Right.
the predominant Western view, not only in the United States, but in other nations.
Right. And I think if we talk about history, and it's still in the same vein of thought, but I think that we can move to 2020. I often hear people and listen to people, and I think of the new citizens and the new people have come into this country from Latin American and Central American countries. And I hear the same prejudicial statements and the lack of appreciation for culture that I think was very much back in the 19th century, with a lack of appreciation and a lack of culture. So is it this continuum of, I've often wrestled with the fact, racism rears its head in many different forms. And is this what American history has been predicated upon? It's always a thing I wrestle with as a historian. I look at Native Americans' loss of land and extinction in many instances from the very beginning in 1607 and before. So it's just, this is one of the things that, as ugly as this is, to try to study it and to try to wrestle with it and try to understand it, so that, when Al and I are in a classroom and we're explaining to this, or you're having a conversation with a group of people as we're having right now, to have that knowledge and try to explain that, I think is so ever important. And the opening question, what is history? I think one very, very salient point of history is to try to explain.
So when we teach history, particularly below the college level, we're teaching in survey courses. So we're going very, very quick through a lot of things.
Yes.
Is the purpose of doing that to really teach history, or is the purpose of that, and once again, I'm being a cynic, is it a morality play? Are we trying to inculcate into students a concept of manifest destiny, of American exceptionalism, so that we have a progression of it? And this is one of the things that bothers me, is we talk about the progress in these survey courses and very rarely talk about the steps back that the nation has made and had to re-overcome. So why do we teach history, particularly at the junior high and high school levels? What's the purpose of it?
I think that the junior high and high school levels, and I've had a very rich and varied career. So I've taught junior high and high school. And I think that one of the reasons that we do teach that, there used to be something that was citizenship education. So, there was even classes, just civics, that was part of ninth grade civics, and understanding the Constitution. But I think that for a young person to understand from where a region or a country came from in which he or she lives, I think is important. I think for that understanding. Now, educators play with this constantly. What grade is the best grade to teach this? So I think right now it's 8th grade American history, then you pick it up again maybe in 11th grade. So there's a lot of nuances and understanding by the time you get to be 16, 17 in the 11th grade, as opposed to being 12 and 13 in the 8th grade. So I stand by the fact I think it's important to teach history in the 7 through 12 secondary schools. Now, survey classes are being attacked, and in fact, at USM, we have even given some majors. It used to be, and Al can talk about this too, everybody had to have History 101 and 102. You had to have World History 101 and you had to have World History 102, whether you were a religion major or a chemistry major, you were going to have those two classes because there was this notion of a liberal arts education and for you to understand. And the world was taught to you from the beginning to about 1600 in 101, and then from 1600 to modern time in 102. And you ran through that history in a semester. So you're correct. It was a hit or miss. There were standards to be met. But that's changing. Oftentimes now, students can, depending on their degree program, choose whether they want to take one of those history classes, and perhaps they would take...
So today, as we look at people needing to know the importance of history, and this is a terrible question, but I kind of think we need to wrap up, and so I'm going to end with a terrible question. How much history do people need to know? What should the average American know about our country? I know you can't say specifics, but if you're out there and you say, I really need to know more about the history of this nation and the world, what should the average person know?
And again, it's with all sincerity. I think people should know as much history as they possibly can. In this year of 2020, with all of the turbulent things that are going on, economically, politically, socially, everything that is occurring, it's the perfect time to say, take a history class, read a history book, talk to any person at any university. If you reach out and email them, they will answer. I mean, I would be thrilled to have someone get in touch with me from the community. It's not a closed society on the university world. So open yourself up, read what you can, learn what you can, and I think you will become, this is me, a better informed, understanding citizen.